go straight to the second lecture of Professor Carmem Gilardoni.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, so thank you, like Rafael said, for being here. Nice and early, ready for in your flip-flops in this cold morning, so I appreciate it very much. I'll keep this nice and easy and slow, and not too long today. Do interrupt me if you want. So like I said yesterday, we've kind of gone over the electronic structure of the NV center diamond. So you've refreshed your solid state physics and atomic physics a little bit. Today we'll go more towards how do we do quantum control on these things. So I think it will be a little bit more familiar for you. But that's kind of what I want to introduce to you. How do we do spin control protocols in the lab? What do we need for that? And then how can we use these protocols to implement these systems as quantum sensors and quantum computers? And again, all of the results that I'll present are performed by very competent people, but I'm not involved, so I'm very happy to introduce these works to you, but you're welcome to go and read more about them. Right. So what we said yesterday is the NV center diamond is defect over here. It's a nitrogen next to a vacancy. It sits in this diamond crystalline lattice. Right, so the diamond lattice functions kind of like an inert host. It only interacts with the system through these phonons. The electronic structure of this defect looks a little bit like this. So we have a spin triplet ground state, a spin triplet excited state. We can drive optical transitions between these two states. We also have a singlet manifold over here. Or spin 1 ground state looks a little bit like this. It has these non-degenerate spin sublevels even at zero magnetic field. But then we can further apply a magnetic field to the system and split these degeneracy, and then we can use microwave pulses to drive transitions between these spin states, right? The Hamiltonian that describes this ground state, it looks a little bit like hell. You have these multiple terms over here. This term describes the dipole-dipole interaction between the spins that are trapped within this electronic wave function, right? So that's modified if you modify the crystalline lattice. If you change the temperature of your crystal, or if you apply some pressure to your diamond, you can modify this Hamiltonian term. This is, of course, the Zeeman interaction, right, for the electronic spins. These electrons also interact with electric fields, exactly due to this fact that these two dipoles that make up this spin 1, the interaction between them depends on sort of the spatial spread of the electronic state. So if you apply magnetic field, electric fields, and you change the spatial spread, you also change this Hamiltonian, so this is the response to that. And then finally, this electronic spin 1 system also interacts with nuclear spins in its vicinity. And that's one resource that we'll use a lot, or that the works that I want to present to you today use a lot, right? So these hyperfine interaction describes that, exactly that interaction between the electronic spin and the nuclear spins. And then each of the nuclear spins that are in the crystalline lattice, or that the NV can interact with, also interact with their own magnetic fields, and with its quadrupole moment, right? So that's kind of the system and the degrees of freedom that we have to play with. And what I also introduced to you is that the system has this non-radiative photophysical pathway that has two important consequences, right? On the one hand, it allows us to read out the state of the spin in the system using its photon emission rate, right? So how many photons it emits under a certain control sequence. And the second consequence is that you can initialize the spin of your system, the electronic spin, through a repeated cycle of photoexcitations, right? So if the system goes through this cycle repeatedly, eventually it ends up in this situation where the spin is initialized, right? And these two factors combined, right, this optical readout and the spin properties of these systems, give rise to sort of an intuitive operation loop where we can use light to initialize the system. We can then use microwaves to manipulate the system, and then we use light to read out the state of the spin. Right? And all of the protocols that I'll show you today are based on this type of cycle, right? They're combinations, different combinations of these type of cycles. So if we want to do sensing, for instance, or if we want to characterize the spin of the system, what we do is we use a technique called optically detected magnetic resonance, and it's no different than to any magnetic resonance that you may have seen in the past, be it NMR or EPR or so on, with the difference that now we detect this magnetic resonance between the spin sublevels by illuminating the system and collecting light, right? And the combination of these two features that I've just shown to you makes it such that if we scan now the frequency of the microwaves that we apply into our system, while we're continuously illuminating the system, the fluorescence, the number of photons that we can collect out, depends on whether these microwaves are on resonance or off resonance to any type of spin transition, right? So what you end up with is with a magnetic resonance spectrum that looks a little bit like this, where you have these two spin transitions over here, right? And you can observe these spin transitions by the change in the fluorescence of the NVs. Now, if we want to do quantum sensing, for instance, or if we want to do sensing with these systems, that's a feature that we can use, right? So we can look at one of these resonance features over here. We can then park our microwaves here at the slope of this resonance, and we can track the change in fluorescence of the system. And from this change in fluorescence, we can infer quantities that the NV is interacting with. Right? So if I start out with this resonance, and the magnetic field that the NV is subject to changes a little bit, this resonance will shift left or right. That shift will give rise to a change in fluorescence, and that's what I actually detect, right? That's my measurement, that's my observable. I can use this to sense magnetic fields, for instance, and the sensitivity that I get, so how sensitive my sensor is, depends on, of course, how dependent the position of this resonance feature is with respect to the quantity that I'm trying to sense, right? So that's this derivative over here. The width of this feature, that's this guy over here. The contrast, so how different is my photon emission rate if I'm off resonance versus on resonance, that's the C over here. And then the square root of PL, that's just how quickly I can integrate above shock noise, right? When I'm counting photons, I'm always subject to this Bosonian noise that comes from counting individual photons. And this number over here just tells me how quickly I can integrate above this shock noise limit, right? And this is a methodology for using these things for sensing that it's quite powerful. So I want to show a couple of results that are based on these type of systems, right? So I have here in this work, what they have is an atomic force probe, right? So this is a probe that they can scan over any type of material that they're trying to study, right? And this probe has a diamond tip, and at the tip of this diamond you have a single NV. So someone asked yesterday if I do this with single NV centers or with ensembles. In this type of experiment, what I have is a single NV over here, right, at the tip of my probe. And I can scan this above any type of sample that I'm trying to study. In this case, they were studying a layered material, so this is a van der Waals type of material, you can exfoliate it, and it's anti-ferromagnetic, right? And what they've shown here is that this anti-ferromagnetism in this material arises between the layers, right? Every time you stack a layer on top of each other, its magnetization is flipped with respect to the previous one, right? So that's the type of anti-ferromagnetism that they're seeing here. And as they scan this tip above this sample, what they infer through the readout of the photoluminescence of the sensor is the magnetic field, right, that the sensor is experiencing. And what you see here is that you have this sort of enhanced magnetic field at the edges of these flakes. And from these type of measurements, they can then use Maxwell's equations to reconstruct what is the magnetization of the sample. Right? So it's a multi-step process. Right? So you start off with reading out the photoluminescence. That's the quantity that you have to work with. From that, you infer magnetic fields that this thing is sensing. And then from these inferred magnetic fields, you can reconstruct the magnetization using Maxwell's equations. Right? And well, the main result here is that when they do that, what they see is that in this region that is 3 layers thick, so it's an odd number of layers, you have strong magnetization arising. But if you move on to this region here, where it's only 2 layers thick, then the 2 layers have magnetizations that are aligned anti-parallel to each other. So this magnetization disappears, right? So that's the kind of thing you can do with these things. You can also use them for biological studies. So this is a study where they use now an ensemble of NVs. So for those of you who asked whether we work with singles or with ensembles, it depends a little bit what we're looking for. In this work, they use an ensemble of NVs, so a diamond crystal here with a myriad of NVs in it. And they grow neuronal cells on top of this diamond, right? And they can give electrical stimuli to these neuronal cells, and they use the magnetic fields that are generated through the flow of ionic information through these neurons to actually infer the response of these neuronal cells, right? To detect the response of these neuronal cells. So they give a certain stimulus, there's certain electric current flow through these neuronal cells. That flow gives rise to stray fields, right? To stray magnetic fields, and that's what they detect with the NVs. Now, the reason why they work with an ensemble here is if you can make notice here that here they're detecting sort of 350 microtesla size fields, right? In this experiment, they're looking for below a nanotesla size fields, right? So by reading out an ensemble of NVs, what we can do in the lab is we parallelize this measurement, we can integrate much faster, and we can get a much better signal-to-noise ratio on the size of fields that we can detect, right? The difference there is that you lose a lot of your spatial information, right? So now you're limited in the lab by how tightly you can focus your light onto this ensemble, so you don't have the spatial information anymore, right? And what they're detecting here is exactly this magnetic field that this NV senses versus the delay time to this stimulus that they give out. So we have these 2 types of detection techniques. Either we read out an ensemble or we read out a single NV that directly influences the sensitivity that we have. I think I'll just skip the second part for now. Like I said, the Hamiltonian of the system looks like a mess. It describes interactions with a lot of different quantities. So as long as you can control some of these interactions, you can also use these systems to detect other quantities, for instance, a change in temperature or a change in pressure. Now, this is all nice and relatively easy to do in the lab. It's working with a system that is a quantum sensor, but it's not performing quantum sensing, right? All that I've done here is I've looked at the response of a resonance to a certain stimulus. I haven't really used any of the quantum resources that we discussed yesterday, such as coherence and entanglement, to gain any sensitivity, right? So there's other techniques that allow me to do that, and that's just a leftover. Disregard that from my translation of the slides. But there's other techniques that we can use to gain information from these quantum mechanical resources and from the quantum mechanical behavior of the system. And those are sort of the techniques that I want to introduce to you. I want to introduce these to you because they're really important when we're also designing control algorithms in order to use the NV to interact with other qubits in its vicinity, right? So they're quite relevant in that way. Right? So I can take my spin 1 system over here, I apply a magnetic field, so I break this degeneracy, and now I focus on only 2 of its quantum states, right? So this is my qubit, and those are the states that I'm concerned about for the rest of today, right? And when we're doing these quantum sensing protocols or these quantum control protocols, what we're interested in is how the quantum state of the system changes over time and whether we can gain some information from these changes, right? So what we do is we just track the quantum state of evolution over time, right? And the phase that the system acquires as it evolves, and we use this phase acquisition as our probe. So just a little reminder of how we control the quantum state of the system. I've talked about echoes yesterday, and Christian has talked about echoes yesterday, and sort of how important they are. But all of the quantum control that we perform on the system, or at least on the spin, is via microwaves, right? We're using microwaves to interact with this transition over here, and we can design our quantum control gates, right, by looking at the behavior of these states as we apply microwaves of variable times. When we do that, and if you recall your quantum 2 courses, we just see Rabi oscillations, right? So our spin will oscillate with a certain frequency that is determined by the intensity of this microwave field. And we can define, for instance, our quantum gates, so for instance this pi/2 pulse, as just microwave pulse that takes me here from my prepared state to a superposition state, right? So that takes me halfway in the Bloch sphere, right, from the Z pole to the Y pole, for instance, right? I can continue applying microwaves, I can apply another microwave pulse, for instance, and that will do a full pi rotation, so that will take my 0 state into my 1 state, and vice versa, right? So now, if in the quantum information language, whenever you're working with these systems and you see these type of operations, right, a Hadamard operation is just in the lab, it's a pi/2 microwave pulse that we apply, right? We take our microwaves, we tune the time of our microwave pulse so that it takes us exactly halfway through a full rotation of the Bloch sphere, right? Now, if you're in your quantum circuit, you see this type of operation. This is a flip, right? 180-degree flip around X. That's just a pi pulse, so it's just a slightly longer pulse. And those are the basis. Those control gates, those quantum gates, are the basis of all the protocols that we will discuss from here on. Right? So the simplest protocol for sensing, particularly, that uses some type of quantum mechanical behavior is just relexometry. What that is, it's just tracking how quickly my system thermalizes. So if I prepare a quantum state, if I prepare sort of a pure, right, state, how quickly does it take until it thermalizes? How do I do that? Well, I told you, whenever we're talking about initializing these systems, we're talking about illuminating them, so we illuminate them for a certain amount of time, right? And then we compare the results of 2 different experiments. In the first experiment, I apply a pi pulse and I let my system evolve for a certain amount of time. And in the second experiment, I do nothing, right? So I prepare my state. When I've prepared my state, it's sort of fully here in this configuration. If I apply a pi pulse, what I do is I invert these populations, and then I allow my system to thermalize. If I do nothing, my system thermalizes from this bright state over here. Right? I repeat these experiments for a number of times, right? Of course, I have to integrate, and I have to repeat this experiment a lot of times. And what happens is that, on average, I'll measure a dark system for my signal experiment, and I'll measure a bright system for my referencing experiment, right? So after I repeat this experiment a number of times, what I see is that the contrast, so the difference in my signal minus my reference normalized, starts off from a certain number, full contrast, and it decays back to 0 with a relaxation time t1. Right? That's just looking at how quickly my system interacts with the environment. The important thing here is that sources of noise, right, of magnetic noise, change this relaxation time, right? And change this relaxation time in a way that is significant. And if I assume that all my other degrees of freedom are controlled, I can use these changes of relaxation time to infer something about the concentration of paramagnetic sources of noise, for instance, in the environment. And that's a tool that you can use when studying, for instance, the presence of reactive oxygen species in different cells. So people nowadays can take nanodiamonds. These are sort of crystalline, nanometer-sized particles of diamond that have these NVs inside of them. They can functionalize the surface of these nanodiamonds and put them inside of specific structures inside of cells, right? And then they can use processes like this, so this change in relaxation time, to infer something about the concentration of these paramagnetic reactive oxygen species, right, inside cells. And then you can give these cells different stimulus, right, and you can sort of deplete them of oxygen, and that's the process that we know creates more free radicals that are paramagnetically active. And you can show that this concentration of free radicals increases by probing this difference in relaxation time. It's a tool that you can also use in solid state research, right? So this is the work led by the group of Lukin, where they're looking at electron transport in a graphene channel. So this device over here is a graphene channel with two electrical probes that they can use to flow current through this graphene channel. And as they start to increase the current that they see, that they inject into this graphene channel, what they observe is that as holes flow through this graphene channels, they start to scatter and create phonons. And the more phonons are created, the more likely these holes are to scatter again, right? So this phonon creation process happens in a sort of cascade behavior, similar to Cherenkov instability, for instance. And the presence of these phonons gives rise to, again, more magnetic noise that these authors actually probe through the readout of single NV centers, right? So below the graphene channel, what you see is a membrane of diamond, and every bright spot over here is a single NV that they can probe, right? And they probe the relaxation of these NVs in order to infer something about magnetic noise. Now, these measurements, again, are nice, but they're not quantitative. They can give you information about materials, about different environments, but they're not really quantitative. So what if I were to use the quantum coherence of the NV in a more quantitative way in order to gain information about different materials that I want to study or different processes? Then I really need to start looking at specific pole sequences of combinations of illumination and microwaves, right? So one of the experiments I can run is this Ramsey experiment, and if you're familiar with NMR, or depending on your quantum 2 course, you may have looked at it. But what we're doing here is the following. Again, I start out with an initialization step, right? Now, what I do is I apply a pi/2 pulse, right? So after my initialization step, what I end up with is a system that is at my 0 state. I give it a pi/2 pulse, so I bring it here into the equator of my Bloch sphere. I create a coherent superposition of 0 and 1 states. I let my system evolve, so it acquires a certain phase, right? That depends on the energy splitting between these levels. And then, in order to read out, what I need to do is I need to map it back onto my optical basis, right? I need to map it back onto the basis where I have contrast. I do that with the second pi over 2 poles, right? And then I read it out. And now, depending on the time that my system has evolved for, I'll either map it back onto my 1 state, which is dark, or I'll map it back onto my 0 state, which is bright, or somewhere in between. Now, again, I repeat this measurement a number of times, and I track the fluorescence of my system versus the delay time between these two pulses. And what I see is, again, an oscillatory behavior like this. My system oscillates between being bright and being dark. Now, what I can do is the following. If I've characterized this behavior very well, so I know exactly what my unperturbed Hamiltonian looks like, and I know exactly what my system should do, what the result of this measurement should be if it were unperturbed. Now I can track changes to this oscillatory behavior, right? Again, through tracking a change in photoluminescence, and from that I can infer something about the change in the energy levels of my qubit, right? I can infer something about how these energy levels have changed, given that I have now perturbation that gives rise to this shift in energy levels. Right? Now, what's clear here is that if my system is more coherent, so if I can track this behavior for a longer time, I can acquire, for the same change in energy levels, I can acquire a larger phase, so that enhances my sensitivity. So in order to use these processes for sensing, what I ideally want to work with is with a system that is more coherent, right? That gives me more time to acquire phase, where my sensor can live for longer, and through that time evolution, I can acquire larger phases given the same type of stimulus, right? The same size stimulus. So here, I actually want to skip this, and I'll go back to it. So here I want to actually make a remark. Whenever we're talking about this parameter estimation process, that's a statistical process, right? I need to use statistics to analyze these things. And the main question I'm dealing with is how sure can I be that my inferred parameter coincides with the real physical parameter that I want to sense, right? Given that we observe a certain result for a measurement, right? In this case, it's a change in PL, right? So mathematically, that's given by this expression over here, right? It's given that, so this is the probability of inferring a parameter change delta theta, given that my system observes a physical property delta B, right? And that's given by the probability of measuring my observable, given that the system observes delta B, multiplied by the probability of estimating delta theta, given that I measured delta B. Right? So that's the two types of probabilities that I'm dealing with here. And how accurate I can be about the parameter that I've measured, that's the variance of my system, and that's given by the Kramer-Rao bound. It's a quantity that we deal a lot in quantum sensing, but that's basically related to the number of measurements that I'm performing, right? So the more measurements I'm performing, the smaller the variance of the parameter that I'm trying to estimate, right? Given that I'm doing a sensible measurement, right? And that's what the quantum Fisher information is telling me. The Fisher information is just telling me how much my observable should change given that parameter that I'm trying to detect, right? So if I'm performing a measurement that provides me no information on a certain parameter, then this variance just goes to infinite, regardless of how many times I measure, right? So that's the kind of thing we want to optimize then. It's sort of performing the correct measurement for that parameter that we're trying to sense, right? Now, I'm going to go back. That was just in the wrong spot. Okay. So, that's all in all nice and well. I can use these Ramsey evolution protocols to detect DC fields, but what happens if I want to detect a field that's changing in time? If I'm trying to detect a field that's changing in time, what I would want to do is I would want to perform an echo measurement. And you may have heard about them. They're widely used in dynamical decoupling techniques that I'll also mention briefly. But the idea here is that I do exactly the same experiment I've done before, but now I add a spin flip operation here halfway through my evolution time. Right? So I create a coherent superposition, I let my system evolve for a certain amount of time, and then I flip my quantum state. Right? So I swap zeros and ones in my quantum state, and then I let it evolve for the same amount of time. And when I do that, during this first evolution time here, I've acquired a phase that's shown explicitly here, right? But then after my spin flip operation, what I've done is I've swapped these two guys, right? And as I acquire the phase in my second time evolution, I acquire it on the other part of my quantum state. And now this has become a global phase factor. I can, to a large degree, get rid of it, and I end up with a very well-defined quantum state that does not depend anymore on my evolution time, right? So, when I'm doing this experiment, this is not sensitive to DC fields or to slowly varying fields, right? If I have a field that is varying slower than my experiment time, then this type of measurement is no longer sensitive on it. So this is a technique that we use widely to preserve or to protect the state of our qubit. So if you're looking at a quantum information protocol like this, and there's a certain amount of time where you do nothing on your spin qubit, in reality, in the lab, what you're doing is you're doing this, right? Doing nothing onto a spin qubit for us means doing this. Because here, we're actually protecting it from dephasing or from decohering due to interactions with the environment, right? So that's to show that when we're talking about gate fidelity numbers, right, when we're talking about gate fidelity quantifiers, that's what us experimentalists are dealing with. It's not only when we're operating or when we're doing our unitary operations that we have to worry about what our gate fidelity is. It's also when we're doing nothing, right? In order to do nothing, we need to keep interacting with the system and flip-flopping, right? So that adds up very, very quickly. Now, I'll just mention this very briefly. When we're doing an echo measurement, and for the results that I'll show you, we can always, again, use a comparison between two experiments, one that we use as a signal, another one that we use as a reference. And in this case, what we do is we use the same pulse sequence, right? So the same spin control sequence. Only at the end, instead of doing a pi/2 rotation, we do a minus pi/2 rotation. Right? And what that does is, if it would map my state onto the zero state for the pi/2 rotation, the mapping is inverted for the minus pi/2 rotation, right? So we can now analyze these results with respect to a certain contrast value that depends on the difference between these two experiments. And it just allows me to get rid of a lot of sort of other effects that may come in. Right? And when I do that for a typical echo measurement, what I see is, again, this is a logarithmic scale, right? I have tau over here, that's my evolution time. And then I have this contrast measure. And that contrast just decays, and it will decay with a certain time scale. That's just the coherence time of my qubit, right? That's what I would typically see. Now, what happens if my qubit is interacting with time-varying oscillating fields, right? With AC fields? I can have 2 or 3 regimes for that interaction, or for the time scales involved in that interaction. One regime is where my time varying field is varying very slowly with respect to my experiment, right? In this case over here, this field is nearly constant throughout my single experiment, right? And what that means is that my AC field that is actually seen by the qubit during its evolution, it's nearly a DC field, right? During that evolution time, it hasn't really changed any at all. And like we just discussed, that AC field then does not affect my measurement. I can repeat my measurement, and during my full repetition time, my field can be varying. But if it's not varying during a single repetition time, it will not really affect my measurement. And then I can have the opposite regime, where my AC field, right, that my sensor is feeling, is oscillating very fast, right? And it oscillates a lot of times during a single repetition frequency, during a single evolution of my qubit, right? And what that does is it actually effectively averages out to zero, right? As my qubit is evolving, it just sees something that on average at zero doesn't really affect my measurement at all as well. And then I can have this very interesting regime, right, where I have a time varying AC field, right, a time varying field that changes on a time scale that is very compatible with my experiment, right? Now what happens to my quantum state is the following. During this first time evolution over here, I've acquired this phase, right, that is given by my H0 Hamiltonian plus a delta that comes from the interaction with this AC field, or minus a delta. When I flip my state, I also flip my AC field, right? So now the phase that I'll acquire has an opposite sign over here. So now I can't anymore remove this as a global phase factor, right? My quantum state now has a phase that depends on the size of the interaction with this AC field, right? And what happens is now I'll map this back onto 1 or to 0, depending on how long I've evolved for. And if I look at the result of this, of the contrast that I measure versus the evolution time of my system, what I'll see is that I lose coherence for my system, or it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll get to it. I lose coherence for my system when I'm exactly matched here with the repetition rate of my AC field, right? And the shape of this loss of coherence, it's reminiscent of a sinc function, right? So it's just a deep of this time. Now I can keep extending my experiment, right? So I can keep adding flip-flops to this experiment, and what that does is it sort of thins down, it narrows this filter function at which I'm able to actually see the effect of this AC field using my sensor. So we've gone through that, and I'll skip that. So one of the ways that this is an interesting feature to use is to actually look at single nuclei, right, with a nuclear spin that are surrounding the NV, right? So in these experiments, what we're doing is we're actually using the electron spin of the NV as a probe for nuclear magnetic resonance, right, of the nuclei that are surrounding this NV. And this is a sensing protocol. You can use it to detect different nuclei that are in the vicinity, but it's also very useful if you want to implement larger qubit cluster states based on the NV, and I'll show how that arises. So now imagine this situation, right? I have an NV here in diamond. My diamond is isotopically natural, so some of the carbons that are in my diamond are carbon 13s, and these have a nuclear spin, right? So they have a magnetic moment. This magnetic moment can interact with the electronic spin through the hyperfine interaction. And the size of this hyperfine interaction depends on the distance between the electron spin, the electronic spin here, and the isolated carbon 13s, right? So each of these carbons will evolve, if I apply a magnetic field, with its own normal precession rate that depends, first of all, on its nuclear Zeeman interaction, but then also on how strongly it interacts with this electron spin. So each of these carbons has its own sort of evolution timescale, right? And the evolution of these magnetic moments gives rise to an AC field, right, that this electronic spin feels, right? It gives rise to a slowly varying interaction with a hydrophile, with a nuclear spin that is changing its direction over time. Right? So I can now use the same protocol that I've just introduced to you, right? A combination of these pi pulses with evolution times a certain number of time. And I can do that, or these people who are very nice and very, very capable can do that, and they can track, right, the quantum state that they're able to map out at the end, right? And what they get is something like this, right? It's a slowly varying thing. This is just the overall decoherence of the NV. But on top of this slowly varying thing, you have these dips, right? That could at first sight look like noise, but if you sort of zoom into one of these regions and you look a little bit closer, you see that these are just composed of overlapped sync functions like the ones that I've just shown you, right? And they're repeating because, of course, every time you sort of match a harmonic of this variation time of the or more precession of the nucleus, you will see something similar, right? So they can fit each of these dips to interactions with individual nuclear spins. And at this stage, I think they were talking to 27 individual nuclear spins, right? So they were able to detect exactly the distance and the interaction between the central NV electronic spin and 27 different nuclear spins. I think by now they're at the point where they can look at 100 or so of these, so they can identify 100 magnetic moments coming from carbon-13 nuclei that are surrounding this NV, and they can tell exactly where these carbon nuclei are and what their interaction strength is to the NV. Not only that, you see on top of these sort of very sharp resonances, what they see is sort of these shallower and a lot broader resonances. And these are related to the carbon-carbon interaction rates. Right? So these are coming from the fact that these nuclei, sometimes they're close enough that they can talk to each other through dipole-dipole interaction, and that talk gives rise to sort of a collective behavior, right, for these carbon pairs. Right? So they can tell where the carbon pairs are as well, and what the interaction strength is between them. So for sensing and for doing NMR and looking at molecules, for instance, this can be a very useful tool, right? You can use the NV in order to do NMR on individual molecules, for instance, so you can think of going to that regime. But one of the reasons why that's interesting is, like Christian said yesterday, every sensor is also an actuator, right? So if I can detect the presence of these carbon nuclei using the NV, and here I've put this plot, but I'll just explain very briefly. So here what they're doing is the same experiment as here, right? But they're increasing the number of pulses, and what you can see is, first of all, that you extend the coherence of the NV electronic spin by a few orders of magnitude, right? So they start off from 20 or so milliseconds, and they go up to 2 seconds. Right? So they extend the coherence of the electronic spin, but also you see these resonance features that are coming from the interaction with these individual nuclei sharpening up, right, and becoming a lot better defined as you increase the number of pulses, right, as you thin down this filter function that you can use in your sensing protocol. But okay, so how can we use this? Christian has mentioned yesterday that every sensor is an actuator. So if I can see the presence of these carbon nuclei around, can I also use the NV to actually control these carbon nuclei in the vicinity? and in that way create a cluster where I can use a single electronic spin, right? A single electronic spin, which I can use light to read out and so on. I have mechanisms of actually talking to this quantum state of the NV. Can I use that as a mediator of interactions with neighboring nuclear spins, and in that way build a cluster of qubits that are now based on carbon nuclei, but where I can do all my interactions and read out through the electronic spin. And the answer to that is yes, and that's demonstrated in this paper from a few years ago. In this work, what they're doing is they're talking to a single NV center, and they're using that to actually communicate with 11 carbon 13s that are in the vicinity. And there's a few reasons why they're doing that with 11 rather than the 27 that they were able to talk to here. And we can get into that, but I'll start slower through the experiments. So, like I said, if you're thinking about using this electronic spin here as a mediator of sort of information transfer to these carbon 13s that are nearby, there's two challenges that arise. This as a quantum computer, right? You have multiple qubits that you can read out, where you have some mechanism of actually interfacing them with photons, so you could potentially interface two systems like this that are remotely separated. Right? But there's a couple of challenges that we have to deal with. So the first of them is the following. If I'm talking to each of these carbon 12, I want to do that via RF fields, right? So oscillating magnetic fields that are in the sort of megahertz range, and this is a slow process. So typically, while I'm trying to control these carbon 12 nuclei, what happens is that my electron spin is decoherent, right? So that's what we've briefly mentioned a few minutes ago. So this electron spin, it decoheres while we're trying to drive the nuclear spin. And the next challenge is the following. For these systems, in order to obtain this interface, this interaction is strong enough that the interaction between the nuclear spin and the RF field depends on the electron spin evolution, right? So it becomes a lot harder to design my gates in such a way that I know exactly what is the operation here that I'm applying onto my nuclear spin when I'm trying to control it, right? So these people have found a solution to that, and that's based on exactly this difference, right? So if I have my electron spin over here, forms a qubit, right? And it couples to my nuclear spin. Right? And this coupling is given by this Hamiltonian, so I just have the Larmor precession frequency of the nuclear spin, right? That's just the nuclear Zeeman interaction. And then I have a hyperfine term, right? I have my interaction between my electron spin and nuclear spin with some type of hyperfine term. And here, for simplicity, I'll just assume that this is zero, right? That this is the only term that you have. Now, the splitting, the energy splitting for the nuclear spin, now depends on whether my electron spin is in the state 1 or in the state 0. Now that makes sense, right? So if I take a nuclear spin and it's seeing an electron spin over here, but this electron spin can either be in an mass equals 0, so it has no effective electron spin projection, right? Or it can be in an mass equals 1, and there it has some type of electron spin projection. Now, you can imagine that the field that this nucleus feels due to the electron spin is different in either case, right? Whether my electron spin is anti-aligned or if it's aligned. So now, what the protocol that they design is based on the following fact, right? They apply an RF field at this frequency over here. So they apply an RF field that is on resonance with this transition. What that means is that that RF field is not on resonance with that transition, right? It's only resonantly driving my nuclear spin, given that my electron spin is in this state, right? If I go into the rotating wave approximation, my Hamiltonian looks a little bit like this, and I could derive this, but for the sake of time, and we all want to go to the boat a little bit later, I won't do that. But just take my word for granted that my Hamiltonian looks like this in the rotating wave approximation. So what that means is the following. If my electron spin is in the zero state, what my RF field is doing is it's driving a precession around the z-axis for the nuclear spin. And if my electron spin is in the one state, my RF field is driving a precession around an axis that is defined by the phase of my RF field. So this phi over here is the phase of my RF field, and the amplitude of that rotation is defined by this Rabi, effective Rabi frequency that is related to the amplitude of this RF field and the time that it's on. So now I can, or they can design these type of pulse sequences where they interleave pi pulses on the electron spin, right? So these are just pi pulses that flip-flop my electron spin with RF pulses of variable phase, right? So they choose a phase for this first RF pulse, a different phase for the second RF pulse, and so on and so forth. And when they do that, they can design some type of evolution on the Bloch sphere for the nuclear spin, where if my electron spin is in the zero state, I start out from here, and I precess right around the z-axis. Now I flip my electron spin, so I'll start precessing around another axis in this vertical direction. And then I flip my electron spin again, and I precess. So in that way, you can sort of non-trivially start out from a certain nuclear spin state and end up right in a rotated nuclear spin state. But just instead of going directly from here to there, what I've done is I've taken this non-trivial path here that is sort of corrected for the electron spin state. Right. Now I can wisely choose these phases that I apply to my RF field for even or odd pulses. And by carefully choosing these phases, I can give rise to either 1 qubit rotations for the nuclear spin or 2 qubit gates for both for the nuclear spin conditional on the electron spin. Right? So that's the type of protocol that you would apply in the lab in order to now perform operations on the nuclear spin and at the same time preserve the coherence of the electron spin. Right? So when we're talking about doing a unitary here on this nuclear spin, that's what we're talking about. That's the type of protocol that we're running. We're continuously addressing the electronic spin to preserve its coherence, and then we're applying RF pulses that are non-trivial, right, to the nuclear spin, but that allow me to take a very well-defined path on the Bloch sphere, right, from a certain state to another state. So that's what these people do, and they do a similar thing to the previous experiments to actually identify the nuclear spins that are close by. So in this case, they are showing 6 here, but I think they have a couple more. They run a similar type of pulse sequence over here. Now, if I'm talking about performing a certain quantum circuit on these pairs of qubits, right, and performing some type of entangling operation, what I have to start with is some initialization protocol. We know we can initialize the electron spin very easily through optical transitions, right? So that's just what we do. We start off with the electron spin initialized. We start off with the nuclear spin in a mixture, right? And then we combine these pi pulses on the electron spin, combined with these gates, right, on the nuclear spin. So every time I have a gate on the nuclear spin, this is what I mean, right? That's the type of protocol that we're running in the lab. And we can combine these in order to perform a swap operation, so transfer this state onto the nuclear spin, and then at the end I can do an initialization step on the electron spin again. So I can start off with my electron spin and nuclear spin in a well-initialized state, right? And then just run through sort of your typical quantum information circuit, right? Now that you have these operations available, you know how to operate on the electron spin and you know how to operate on the nuclear spin. You can then just run through your typical quantum circuit algorithm in order to establish entanglement between these things. And then in order to probe entanglement between these two things, what I want to emphasize here is the following. What this whole thing here symbolizes is a state tomography type of measurement, right? We're trying to measure the state of qubit A, that's the electronic qubit, and the state of qubit B, that's the nuclear spin qubit, right? But we're doing that based on measurements on the electron spin, right? So we measure the electron spin, right? We can apply a pi rotation, so we can measure either electron spin up or electron spin down. And conditional on the measurement of the electron spin, we continue, right? We reinitialize the electron spin. We perform a series of pulses on the nuclear spin, which are basically an echo on the nuclear spin. So we're trying to correct the nuclear spin for some evolution of the electron spin that has happened in between. And then we swap, right? We transfer the state of this nuclear spin onto the electron spin, and we perform a second measurement. Right? So this first part here gives me the state of the electron spin, and the second part gives me the state of the nuclear spin. Right? And by doing that, by performing measurements on the electron spin only, then I can reconstruct, right, my full density matrix, right, for this entangled state over here. And I can do that, so I've done that now for interacting with a single nuclear spin, but what is special about these nuclei coupled to the NV is the following, that each nucleus has a different operation frequency, right? Because each nucleus interacts strongly with the NV. Now what I have is that the evolution frequency of each nucleus is different. So I have a way of sort of deterministically select what nucleus I talk to. Right? So what they do is they expand this protocol very naturally, right? By now operating at different RF frequencies. So they can do this type of pulse sequence at the first RF frequency over here, and they can do at the same time this type of pulse sequence at a different RF frequency, and that means they're talking to qubit number 6 over here, right? So that's what they do, right? They start operating or performing these gates on the nuclear spins at their own resonant frequencies, and they can in this way address the nuclear spins independently, right? So they can talk to the electron spin through microwave pulses, and they can talk to each of the nuclear spins via protocols like what I've shown you here, but then at their own resonance frequencies. Right, so you can extend this further, so you can create then a GHZ state for these 3 qubits, the electron spin and the 2 nuclear spins, perform measurements that project this onto a Bell state, and then go through the same type of protocol in order to measure each of the qubits, right? They've done that up to 7 qubits, right? That's where they can still show that you have some entangled state. This is what they predict based on a theoretical model that doesn't include back action, so it doesn't include interactions between the nuclear spins that are mediated by the electron spin. And very clearly they perform worse than that, but they can extend this qubit cluster state that they have all the way up to 7 qubits, and then you start losing your sort of the potential of entangling your 7 qubits. What are the difficulties here? So they show a lot of these operations done in parallel. In reality, they're typically done in series, right? So you would first operate on the first qubit, then operate on the second qubit. There's no necessary reason why that is, but that just extends your measurement time so long that you're sort of reaching here the limits of the coherence time of both your nuclear spins and the electron spin, right? So how can you, so just a couple of remarks to finish. I said I would finish early and I am. A couple of remarks to finish. These type of processes of doing conditional or of designing gates that are slightly non-trivial based on sort of intermittent interactions is actually quite general, and it's used somewhat in the field of quantum dots. It's definitely used for other defect systems for interacting with qubits in silicon, for instance. So it's not only in these systems where we're relying on optics for initialization that these type of things are useful. I think they're quite ingenious. So it just takes understanding what your Hamiltonian is and what your interactions are for your system, and then trying to design that in such a way that takes you to a final state, even though you're taking a slightly non-trivial path, right? The other remark is the following. One of the big advantages, so this work, I think it's very beautiful, this work that establishes this entanglement between all of these different nuclei through the electron spin, or that is spread out through the electron spin. I think it's beautiful, but one of the big advantages of the NV is that it interacts with light, right? And like I mentioned briefly yesterday, you can then use this qubit that interacts with light in order to communicate with a different qubit in a different cryostat somewhere else in the world, right? That also interacts with light. And because these electron spins can actually emit photons that are entangled with its spin state, you can then interfere these photons in order to establish entanglement between these two qubits, right? So between your electronic qubit over here and the electronic qubit over there. And that could be one of the advantages of the NV centering diamond. To my best knowledge, there is no work that tries to expand the size of these computing platforms based on this type of interactions. There's a few reasons for that I'll mention in more detail tomorrow, but the efficiency of these processes, right, of the entanglement distribution processes with the NV is relatively low compared to other systems because of some material science difficulties that we'll discuss tomorrow. But that's one way that you could go, right? So the same idea that I've shown to you here of using this electron spin as a readout mechanism for these nuclear spins could be implemented for other platforms and for other defect systems, where you could then more efficiently use these sort of photon interaction possibilities, right, to distribute entanglement and to actually communicate between these two processing units, right? So I think that's a place to stop. Tomorrow we talk about quantum communication based on these systems and how we can now distribute entanglement between two electron spins of the NVs using photons. Not tomorrow, on Saturday. So I'll leave it at there.
Thank you once more. Questions? We have plenty. Let's start.
Thank you for the lecture. You showed that contrast images where you have like a relaxation to a thermal state, right? Is this some sort relatable to a divergence from the pure state to a thermal state? And if so, can we use that to probe like quantum speed limits and so on for the transformation of states?
I think the answer to that is I don't know. Maybe we chat later and you can explain to me what you mean. I feel like I don't have enough knowledge to actually reply to you, but we can chat. You can tell me what you mean, and maybe we
Okay.
find the.
Thank you for the lecture. And can you go back to the algorithm of the last measurement? Yeah, this one. This black dot in the middle of the measure of the angle are the control gates, right?
Yeah.
Why? So we need this control gate to measure. I don't understand. Sorry.
Because, so maybe it's easier to show here. So in this step, what we're doing is we're reading out the electron spin, right? So we're removing any type of entanglement from the electron spin, right? And what we want to do later is we want to measure what the nuclear spin was, right, after this measurement. So we need, in some way, we need to transfer information from the nuclear spin to the electron spin in such a way that by reading out the electron spin, we can gain information about what the nuclear spin was, right? And that's what we're doing here. That's what this step is.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great lecture. I was thinking, by detuning the MS plus one from the MS minus one or other means, how much control do you have about how long a pi pulse takes on the electronic spin?
On the electronic spin?
Yeah.
That's typically how strongly we can apply microwaves. So it's typically a few nanoseconds. So for the NV center, so the gate on the electric spin, it's independent, right, of the nuclear spin. The gate on the nuclear spin is dependent on the electric spin, but the inverse is not true, right? So for the electron spin, it's just how strong are the microwaves that we can apply, right? And the typical experimental limitation to that is usually some 30 nanoseconds or so. That's how strong we can drive these electron spins.
Okay. And then, can I ask a follow-up? So I assume that if you want to sense an oscillating magnetic field, ideally this field has the same duration as the pi pulse, so that they are on resonance. Then you can apply this pulse continuously, right? And then I think that should be the best field to sense.
I don't fully. So the oscillating magnetic field is my pi pulse, right? So what do you mean? These two? You mean these two?
Not just in the setting of a single electronic spin and you want to sense an AC field. The AC field is on resonance with the pi pulse.
So if I want to do sensing on an AC field, you mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be. No, it can be oscillating at any given frequency. But the AC field is not controlling my qubit, right? If I'm doing sensing on an AC field, the AC field is not controlling my qubit. It's just there, and it's something that the qubit is seeing, right? But it's not driving any resonant transitions. What is driving the resonant transition is the microwave pulse, which is also, right, the time varying. It's an oscillating magnetic field that is coming from some type of resonator. But so these things are independent of each other. This is the microwave pulses that I use to control my qubit. Those need to be on resonance with my electronic transition, with my spin transition, right? If I'm doing sensing, this doesn't have to be resonant with anything. Right?
Thank you.
One final question. Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering when you showed that, I think it was a graph to the material, and you talked about how the flowing of the holes created phonons and sort of a cascade effect.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it would be possible to harness this effect somehow, like for example to make it in a controlled way so you could produce, for example, entanglement in phonons or something like this. Is that possible?
I mean, So these scattering mechanisms are definitely incoherent processes, right? Those are sort of band holes, valence band holes that are traveling through the material and they're scattering. These are sort of, these are definitely incoherent processes. There are mechanisms of entangling, for instance, the qubit with magnetic waves in materials, and that's a little bit better understood. But in this case, I just use a qubit to read out the photons, right? They're not interacting in any coherent fashion.
Just one.
Thank you, fantastic lecture. Question from an ignorant person. So you show these things, but you never show which is the error on detecting these magnetic fields or EC fields and so on. So it's just shot noise error what you have there, or how is the signal? Because normally you need to have an accuracy on how good is the signal that you get.
Yeah. So that's when I showed the so assuming that you're reading out things intelligibly, right, so that you're selecting the correct type of measurement for detecting the stimulus that you're interested in, then you can gain in accuracy by performing more measurements, right, by integrating longer. So typically we give the I didn't show this slide, but this is from a review from last year, which is very interesting, and it's on how you can use these systems in different types of solid state investigations, right, to investigate different phenomena in the solid state. And what this plot gives is the sort of the spatial resolution of the measurements that you can do, right, so how much spatial information you can get, the frequency of operation of the sensor, and this in particular is a fairly versatile sensor because it does operate over a very wide range of frequencies. And then in the color axis, it gives you the sensitivity, but bear in mind that the sensitivity is always given in Tesla per square root hertz, right? So that's for a second of measurement, how much information you can get. And if you want to get more information, you can measure more. And then you're going to start to deal with experimental errors of how well you can stabilize your system and so on and so forth, right? But yeah, so the typical for magnetic fields, for instance, if you're working with ensembles, you can get down to 10 to the minus 12 Tesla per square root hertz, which is a number similar to what vapor cell sensors can do, right? So there's a lot of these quantum sensing protocols are also investigated in vapor cells, and they can go down to 10 to the 12, maybe 10 to the minus 14 Tesla per square root hertz, so very small magnetic field values. But again, it depends on how well you're able to integrate.
Thank you, Carmen. Let's thank Carmen again.